Hello, everyone. My name is Jessie Presswood, and I am here today with LGC Axio Proficiency Testing to welcome you all to this session titled Ingredients for a Successful Supplier Approval Program to Protect Your Brand. Today, your speaker is Peter Begg, the Vice President of Quality and Food Safety at Hearthside Food Solutions. Peter will discuss how to successfully identify and manage risks, especially during a time of crisis, to prevent supply chain disruption and protect brands. We at LGC were thrilled to sponsor this session, as LGC PT also works to help our participants manage risk. In fact, we are launching a partnership across several LGC branches next year that will be aptly named LGC Assure. If you're interested in finding out about how LGC can help with supply chain assurance, make sure to come visit me in the community exchange or stop by my Ask the Expert session tomorrow afternoon. If you have any questions for Peter, please put them in the comments section and use the question mark icon. And be sure to stick around for the post-session chat where you'll be put in small groups so you can meet each other and share your perspectives on the session. And with that, I will send it over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Jessie, and happy to be joining today. This session, supplier quality, supplier approvals are absolutely critical to the food safety program we have here at Hearthside Foods, and I'm sure is just as important to the food safety programs in each of your organizations. As Jessie mentioned, I'm with Hearthside Foods. We're a very large contract manufacturer here based in the United States. I prior to that was with an ingredient company called Glanbia Nutritionals and spent 23 years at Kraft Foods and Mondelez International. So I've worked with a lot of the people I'm sure that are joining today, and happy to share some of the learnings and insights that I've had over the course of my career and also working at Hearthside. So if you go to the next slide. So supplier approval programs are absolutely critical for your business. If you don't have a strong supplier program, it can lead to food safety issues, regulatory compliance issues, something we're all facing now, service and availability issues, and then also brand and reputation issues, depending on the type of impact that supplier or supplier gap may cause. Next slide. So you need a strong supplier approval program. It does need to be foundational for your quality and food safety program. It should include cross-functional support. This is absolutely, for me, critical to the success of the program we have at Hearthside. And it really does require a partnership with the procurement function, those that are purchasing the ingredients, as well as operations, who in many cases are executing the quality program, the quality activities and tasks that we have laid out as part of our supplier and raw material assurance program. So you must get that support to be successful. It can't just be quality owning all of the activities around quality. It needs to be cross-functional in nature. Also, your suppliers should understand your minimum quality and food safety expectations. You have to tell them what it is that you expect, and make sure that you have some sort of document or policy that clearly outlines those expectations, and that you let them know that in some way, and we'll talk about those ways, that you're going to monitor their performance, monitor their compliance to those expectations. Another thing you want to think about is, how do you risk tier your suppliers? How do you put them into different categories? Because we're all faced with minimal resources. Nobody has unlimited resources to manage their food safety and quality program. So how do you best go about managing those suppliers? And one way to do that is by risk tiering them. And there's a number of factors that we'll talk about later where how you can risk tier them. And traditionally, it's always been on the micro, chemical, physical, but I think there's other factors that you need to take into consideration. And finally, your program should lay out what are the minimum requirements for approving a supplier. Again, today, we're all faced with supply chain challenges, ingredient shortages, raw material shortages, labor shortages. So you need to understand what are those minimum requirements that you would require so that you could bring that ingredient or packaging material into your facility. So before we go on, we're gonna take advantage of the polling feature we have here and ask the first question to the audience. So before we get into the background and details around how you build a supplier approval program, I want to ask each of you, how would you rate your current supplier approval program? Do you think it's strong? Do you think it's solid, weak, or non-existent? I hope no one has a non-existent program, but take the time, rate your current program and where you feel it sits, and it'll be great to see the response from the audience. So I think they're bringing up the poll now live into the session, and hopefully you'll be able to then rate it um, as you see your current program. I would say for us at Hearthside, ours is probably somewhere in the solid, but it's not strong yet. We have some areas that we are strengthening as we look at 2022 and beyond. So do we have those results yet, Mark? Okay. So it looks like some people are somewhere between solid and weak. We've got some that are rating theirs as strong. So that's a bit yeah, you've got a bit of sort of a bell curve there, which is to be expected. That you have some people who are rating theirs as weak, a few that are rating as strong, but the majority are saying they have solid supplier approval programs. And I think that one of the things that we'll discuss as we talk about your supplier approval program is, obviously ideal is that you get on site to the supplier. But obviously with COVID, with the challenges of travel right now, with just the availability of resources that you may have, it's not always simple to get on site and see a supplier. So we'll talk about some of the ways that you can still evaluate that supplier and mitigate as best as they can the risk that you have as you bring that supplier or that material into your facility. Okay, so that looks good. I think we'll now move on. So your supplier approval has to be part of your integrated quality management approach, and it really needs to look across the supply chain. So if you think about where the suppliers play a role, it's really across the entire spectrum of your food safety plans, your HACCP plans, and your overall food safety program. When you're designing your products, obviously choosing suppliers comes into that. What type of material are you're going to use for that product? What is the foreseeable use of those materials? And then once you decide, here's the formula, here's the product I'm going to manufacture, then you look at, well, how do I select the right suppliers? Do I have supplier quality expectations? Do I need to perform any audits? Do I need to do any COA verification related to the materials that I'm getting? So all those will come into play in how you evaluate your suppliers. And then once you decide, yes, this is the supplier I'm bringing, I've done my preliminary approval, then what do you do as you bring the materials onto your site? How do you continue to manage your suppliers? What are the specifications that you're asking them to adhere to? What are the incoming material controls, the traceability? What about variation and process capability of those materials? So these are all things that come into play with your supplier approval, but also your supplier management program. And then finally, if you think about distribution, et cetera, looking at traceability, making sure that you're able to trace one up and one back related to the suppliers that you're using. And also, if you think about downstream, there are suppliers as well. The warehouses that you use, the trucks that you use are all part of your overall supply chain and the types of different suppliers. I know we're mainly focused on raw material and packaging suppliers, but you have to also think about the other types of suppliers that you have in your supply chain. And finally, obviously, if there's any complaints, if you receive a complaint about your product, How do you trace that back? Is the suppliers that you have approved potentially a place you need to go and ask questions about their programs, their controls, the lots that were used, to make sure that you can rule out any of those as potential root causes of the complaint that you've received. So again, just in summary, a lot on this slide, but your supplier approval program is integral to your quality management, and it cuts really across each step within the supply chain. So next slide. So if you think about your quality and food safety program, it's really around assessing, managing, and mitigating risk. So around suppliers, what is the risk profile that supplier has? How do they have the ability to meet the standards that you have? What's their food safety plan? Does it focus on prevention? Does it identify risk? And how do they, the supplier, monitor compliance? Do they have a third-party validation, whether it be through a GFSI audit similar to SQF, and obviously you have certification bodies that are many of them participating in this that can help support with that. And how are we validating those key risk mitigation programs, whether it be their allergen management, micro, et cetera, and how does that come into play with which suppliers you decide to approve? And as you think about risk management, auditing of suppliers, how do you decide which suppliers you want to audit? And that's both, if you think about it, it's both internal and external audits. Does the supplier have an internal audit program that they assess their programs with on some frequency? Raw material testing and verification. Again, this is something that I think plays a role in your supplier approval program. Let's say you have a new supplier of a raw material. Do you test the first 3 incoming lots for COA verification? Maybe it's the first 10 lots, depending upon the risk of the material. But you want to make sure that you feel comfortable that the supplier is meeting the standards, the specification that you've set for them. Training is obviously a key piece of your supplier quality program, making sure that, again, you're training the suppliers, but also that they're training their people on the expectations. Traceability goes without saying. How does the supplier manage their traceability back through their system? And then obviously you being able to manage it within your facility. Spec management, again, making sure it's clear what is it that you're holding the supplier accountable for, whether it be a raw material, a packaging good, et cetera. What is the specification? Is it clearly outlined? Quality notification. One of the things that I think is important is that you also have a clearly laid out process for discussing with your suppliers when there's a non-conformity. So if you receive a material, you receive a package, a film or a corrugate, and there's an issue with it, how do you communicate that back to your supplier? Hopefully it's in some sort of documented form. We have what we call a quality notification. And then we send back and we ask for the supplier to perform a root cause analysis and CAPA on that issue. And then risk mitigation. What happens when there is an issue? Do you have a crisis management policy? Does the supplier have a crisis management policy so that they understand how to manage the situation that you've presented with them? And then on business continuity, this is something we're all dealing with today. In many cases, materials aren't showing up, trucks aren't showing up. We recently had that where we were supposed to have a truck come to pick up materials and didn't show up. And so we're all faced with a lot of challenges right now in the supply chain. So what is your process to handle emergency management of your suppliers and your materials? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So next slide. So before we get into this, we're going to do the second poll question, and it goes back to looking at your various challenges that you have with the suppliers that you utilize. How often is your company having to disapprove a supplier due to quality or food safety issues? So if we can bring up the second poll question, I think it's interesting to see how often do you have to disapprove a supplier? Is it daily, weekly, monthly, annually, or never? I hope it's not daily for any of us. I would hope it's not on that frequency, but obviously, uh, if you have a supplier who's not meeting your expectations and you continue to be challenged by them, you should have a disapproval process. You should be able to communicate effectively that what their gaps are, and maybe in some cases I've seen people have a probationary status where there's additional testing required, an on-site audit before they can continue using that supplier. But definitely you should have a formal process so that as you have any concerns or issues with your supplier, they're able to communicate back to them that performance, and then also again hold them accountable and either have additional controls in place, or in some cases, if it's not something that can be corrected, that you disapprove and move on to another supplier. So let's see what the oh wow, a lot of never annually. So um, the never, I'm happy for you, but also a little concerned, only from the standpoint that mistakes happen, and that not every supplier has as strong of a system or a program as I think all of us would like. So for those of you who responded never, I think that's great. But I would also say that make sure that as we go through some of the key items you want to have in your program, that you're taking all those into account, because hopefully you're not missing anything. Again, ideally, the suppliers never present an issue to you as a customer, but I can tell you from experience, unfortunately, that's not always the case. Most suppliers, though, I would say, are very good at correcting. They will find out the root cause, put corrective actions in place, and ensure that the issue doesn't happen again. But occasionally you do deal with a supplier who's unable to rectify that, and then you have to take the appropriate steps. All right. So thanks for the responses to that question. And so I think, did we skip a slide here, Mark? Or is this the next one? There we go. So areas to consider. So when you think about your supplier approval program, and how are you approaching your suppliers, there's a number of questions I would recommend you ask and make sure that you have in place. Do you have an supplier quality expectations policy or manual that clearly lays out what are the areas that you're going to focus on? And again, you may have something different for packaging or raw material suppliers, or the different types of, maybe for a certain type of raw material, you might have more information. But again, laying out clearly those expectations that you have for your suppliers is important. Clearly listing them. So what are those requirements? You have a policy, you have a manual, but then what are the individual requirements that each of those suppliers must meet? And again, it could be different depending on the type of material or whether it's a packaging supplier. And then how do you have, what is your formal supplier approval process? Do you have one? How do you handle emergency or temporary approvals? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Do you risk tier your suppliers? And again, when you risk tier your suppliers, traditionally it's always been about micro, chemical, physical. However, I would also encourage you and challenge you to look at other ways that you may want to risk tier your suppliers in addition to those, which includes country of origin, financial impact, potential for food fraud. There's a number of factors that you can look at, but definitely, you may have a small ingredient that's relatively safe from a micro and chemical standpoint. However, it's used in, let's say, all of your products. And I'm thinking about a number of things where that may be the case. It's used at 1% to 2%, but it would have a large impact on your business if something were to go wrong, if you had a foreign material or something else related to that particular material. So you really want to think about, there are other ways that you may want to risk tier your suppliers, and think about, do I need to do more if it has such a very large impact on my organization? How do you handle food fraud with your high risk suppliers and materials? This is an area that obviously we as an industry have spent more time on recently over the last decade. But how do you handle that with your high risk suppliers? What do you require of them to ensure that food fraud is not a risk? Going back to, when you have a high risk, high impact material, do you perform COA verification on some frequency? And then, and honestly, I talked earlier about you may want to do the first 3 to 10 lots, but then ongoing, do you do any sort of verification, let's say on a quarterly basis? And that's something that we have implemented recently for some of our high impact materials here at Hearthside. I mentioned earlier, do you have a notification process for suppliers when an issue occurs? There's tools that are out there that can be used for this. We have a quality notification form. We log those into our SharePoint system and then send those out to the suppliers through our procurement organization. And then obviously we track the response from the supplier. But do you have a formal process for notifying when an issue occurs? I talked earlier about disapproval processes. If someone fails an audit, you have repeat quality problems, a major food safety issue, do you have a process outlined for disapproving a supplier, and then what are next steps? And then what can they do to become reapproved as a supplier for you? Do you perform on-site audits? Again, in a world of limited resources, that might not always be possible, but maybe you can leverage a third party, like some of the certification bodies like Perry Johnson and others who are on this webinar. There's many of them to choose from that could potentially support you in your on-site audits. And then finally, for your top suppliers, do you have key performance indicators? Are you looking at how you're measuring them? And again, obviously their performance from a microchemical, physical, the quality of your materials, but service, obviously, in this day is absolutely critically important of how frequently we're getting our raw materials on time. Their responsiveness when there is an issue, and there's lots of measures you can put in place and hold your suppliers accountable for. And then do you have quarterly reviews? One of the things that we're talking about doing for next year is for our top 5 raw material suppliers is having a quarterly review so that we can talk and partner with each other on any key issues that we've seen over the course of the year. What are some of the key activities that they're doing to improve their quality program? So those are some of the questions you may want to consider as you think about your supplier quality program and how you approve and manage suppliers. So next slide. So a way to look at supplier approvals, once you identify the need for a new supplier, you should take a number of steps to determine, do they meet your quality and food safety expectations? What is the ingredient going to be used for? And whether there will be a process at your company that reduces or manages the risk. So for example, if you have a raw agricultural product, are you going to have a thermal step to eliminate any micros and reduce the micro load? If you have a raw material that's an allergen, are you going to have a validated allergen clean in your process? So depending on the foreseeable use and how that ingredient is going to be used, you want to make sure that, do you have the appropriate steps in place on your end? And if not, then you need to go back to the supplier and understand how they might be managing that risk. So requesting documentation from the supplier to support your initial risk assessment. So for example, if you have a raw material and you're concerned about allergen cross-contamination, going back to the supplier and asking them, do they have other allergens that are handled on site? If so, how do they do their allergen cleaning and validation to ensure that there's no cross-contamination? How do they handle foreign material controls? Is another key one, because I can speak from experience of having foreign materials in raw materials that have shown up, and it's something you have to address. And then once you get that documentation to support your risk assessment, assessing the ingredient and the supplier for the microchemical and physical risk, as well as those business risks that I talked about before. So now you have all of that information. You can then tier your suppliers into different risk categories and then determine what additional steps do I need for approval. If a supplier is high risk, you may want to consider an on-site audit or utilizing one of the third parties that's on the call. And again, I could go down the list of them, but there's plenty of them that can support you in your needs. And then determine what additional testing or analysis will be needed for the material. Will you need COA verification? Does the supplier use an approved or accredited lab for their testing? So these are all critical questions that you want to ask once you determine, do I need to do additional testing on that supplier as I'm bringing in a new material? And some of this we talked about before. So these are the steps you want to take to get your supplier approved. And again, you should obviously document all of these as part of your ingredient hazard assessment that's required under FSMA. Next slide. So here's some of the documents. When you ask for information from the supplier, here's some of the documents you may want to consider for your supplier management program. Obviously, the product specification, pure food guarantee, their most recent third-party audit report and corrective actions, their food safety plan, ingredient hazard analysis for subcomponents, allergen information, halal kosher, COAs. You can see the list here. But again, I think it's important. This is not meant to be exhaustive, but I think it gives a good sense of the type of documentation you'll want to see before you approve a supplier and a raw material for consideration to use in your facilities to make your products. So, again, the slides will be available, so hopefully you don't have to scratch these down quickly. But, these are some of the types of documents that we at Hearthside require from our suppliers before we will approve them. Okay. If you go to the next slide. So, and then what happens when you do have a supplier quality issue? And again, we could all probably talk in one of the chat rooms about the various ones, but some of the ones that you may see and that you have to address, micro failures due to lack of understanding of requirements. I had a situation, not at my current organization, where we had a supplier who didn't understand that even though their material went through a thermal process, that there could be post-processing contamination. So when we went back and did the investigation, the supplier found that there was some post-processing contamination happening because of not clearly understanding, how do you package the material? How do you have people handling it post the thermal process or the kill step that they had? Another one is identity failure or potential fraud due to lack of supply chain controls. Again, there's a lot of materials that come, especially in the areas like botanicals. They come from plant extracts and a lot of different sources, and making sure that people know what they're buying from. And you could go down the list. Aquaculture. There's been cases where are you getting the fish that it claims it is on the label? There's other areas where, again, if you don't have the right supply chain controls and your supplier doesn't have the right supply chain controls, you could have a potential identity risk when if you test the product and it doesn't come back as you state it does, or the supplier states it does on the label. Foreign material that's not metal detectable. A lot of people, including Hearthside, we have metal detectors in our processes. We may have magnets on incoming materials. As we bring in things like some of the bulk materials, flour, sugar, etc. However, if it's a foreign material that's not metal detectable or magnetic, you could have an issue. Plastic being one. We've had issues where you get paper, you get plastic in the raw material. How are you addressing those, and what kind of risk mitigation does the supplier have in place? But also that you may want to think about whether you do any sifting or screening of raw materials. One that unfortunately we're dealing with right now is infestation. It seems to be a hot topic right now in the industry, where we're seeing a lot of hangups at ports with raw materials, a lot of challenges with materials being delayed in transit, and that really opens them up for potential pest and infestation issues. And it's something you want to watch out for, and that we've seen as well at Hearthside. And then finally, packaging. You can't forget about packaging as part of your supplier approval program. And, an example of, is the packaging coming in with the correct information on it? Obviously, you want to have a standard that you're comparing that packaging against to make sure that, what you're supposed to be on the label, what's supposed to be on the package, whether it be any claims, ingredient lines, nutritional panels, that it matches the right information so that you're not sending something out that has incorrect information on it. So again, these are just some of the type of quality issues you may encounter if you don't have a strong supplier approval and supplier management program. So I think with that is my last slide. And I think we're going to open it up for questions now.
Hi, Peter. How you doing today?
Good, Paul.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Hello, SQF family. I hope everyone is doing well as well. As I mentioned, my name is Paul Demarin. I'm the Senior VP for our Food Safety and Supply Chain Division at PJR FSI. I have the pleasure of moderating the session, the Q&A session today with Peter for what was an excellent presentation. Peter, it's always great to hear you speak, and it's a pleasure to see you again. So let's jump right into
in person next time, Paul. You know, we're looking
I know it seems like we've done this before, haven't we?
Yeah.
So it's great to be here. Listen, Peter, we've got a lot of questions, a lot of different chats. So I'm going to jump right in and ask the first question here. And that is, how are you handling your supplier approvals during the current supply chain issues that the industry is facing as it relates to the pandemic?
Yeah.
And are you having to perform any emergency approvals, and what are you requiring in that regard?
Yeah, well, yes and yes. I mean, we're dealing with those challenges every day, unfortunately, right now, and I think that just seems to be common in the industry as I talk to other peers. We are having to do emergency approvals. We are asking for some minimum information in those cases. We want to see, obviously, their GFSI audit, preferably SQF. And make sure that there was no major findings in their audit. We also ask for what their food safety plan is. Sometimes you need a confidentiality agreement, but at a minimum, we want to make sure food safety plan, and we want to understand if there's any allergens or allergen concerns with their facility. The other thing we're doing, so we may not get we may not get halal, kosher, some of the other ones listed, in a hurry, we may not get all those, but we're at least, especially depending on the application, because we do a lot of ready to eat, making sure we have those couple of key documents in place. And then we may do some additional testing. One of the things that we've done is some additional COA verification, incoming lot testing, which may not traditionally have been done, but again, where we don't have any familiarity with the supplier, we're just trying to protect ourselves. But yeah, it's happening it feels like daily basis right now.
Yeah. I have a few screens going on here with different questions popping in, and one just came in. When risk assessing suppliers, is it more simple, in your opinion, to do a qualitative or a quantitative assessment?
That's a great question. If you have nothing, start with qualitative. Ideally, if you can, one of the things that I've done in the past is actually create a spreadsheet, a matrix, where you rank, microchemical, physical, business risk, fraud risk. You put your different columns and you rank the suppliers on a scale 1 to 10, and then you create a score. That's probably even better, because then you take some of sort of the opinion out of it. Because you get a cross-functional team, you decide, okay, this supplier is low risk from a micro, medium risk from a physical, et cetera, and then you kind of come to a score. But if you have nothing, then I would start with qualitative to say, okay, what do I see as the risk associated with that supplier? Let's say I have 20 suppliers. Let me at least start there. But yeah, ideally, I've seen that successfully. We haven't quite gotten to that level of sophistication yet at Hearthside, but we're working towards it.
Right. Peter, for suppliers that have been disapproved, do you find typically that they're long-standing suppliers or those that are in emergency situations?
I've seen long-standing suppliers get disapproved, unfortunately. In some cases, in at least one case, I can state that, the challenges that we're all facing as an industry, cause people to, because they're trying to get their material out the door, you worry about people taking shortcuts because they're struggling to get labor, to get product out the door, to get product shipped. And they have strong demand for their volumes. I worry about people starting to, maybe take their eye off of things because they're so desperate, basically, to get things made and produced and shipped. And you want to make sure that, nothing's worth harming your consumers over, is a mantra I always say. So yeah, I've seen it with both existing suppliers as well as new suppliers.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. You're right. The brand damage alone is devastating. Here's another question that came in, and it's a little bit of a statement, a little bit of a question, but it says, I'm curious about procuring in emergency situations. Does this process typically follow your standard supplier approval process? In other words, I think, do you deviate in any way, given the fact that it might be an emergency situation?
Well, we still, even if we do emergency approval with those couple of key documents I stated, we will still put them into our regular approval program where we need all of the information, which may include a follow-up on-site audit. But for that emergency approval to get the material in-house, to not lose continuity of supply, we may only look at a couple of those things, do some testing and move on, and then follow up in the following, let's call weeks and months, with the additional documentation, getting them into our system that we use. We use a Supplier Quality system. I'm software agnostic, but we use one of the tools that I'm sure many of you have used in the industry. And so we want to make sure that's still populated for that supplier, even if we do an emergency approval. So we'll continue the process, Paul, even after that emergency approval, to get everything done that follows our normal approval process.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Just so you know, we're getting a lot of great comments and feedback on your session, Peter. So thank you very much. Peter, you know that I've had the opportunity to work with probably thousands of companies now to build and develop out supply chain programs as well. So I hear sometimes from different organizations that there's a lot of support that's required to build and develop out a strong supplier quality program. Do you have any thoughts on that, and how do you differentiate, who gets your time and your resources and your budget?
Yeah, well, if you're a food manufacturer, having a strong supplier approval program and supplier management program, I don't think it's optional. And to me, it starts with, I've had numerous conversations with our CEO, because as I've been with Hearthside now about 9 months, it's an area that we're going to invest in. We're actually talking next week again about supplier quality and how we need to add some additional resources. And resources aren't just people, but it's software. So do we have the right tools to manage, like, the quality notifications? Do we have the right software to manage all of the information that the suppliers are providing? So that's another type of investment. Or also, expenses with third parties. You're leveraging certification bodies and other audit firms to go out and audit some of these high-risk suppliers. So the investment isn't just, you need to add people, but it's what is the holistic investment needed? And that also includes the testing that you may require on some of these raw materials. So we've been having a lot of discussions internally at our company about this, because it's absolutely critical. Because if you don't know what's going into those products, you can quickly have a product quality, the product you're making, an issue that leads to something even greater in terms of brand damage or even worse, or a recall or something of that like. So yeah, a little bit long-winded, but yeah, it takes that senior level support for those types of activities, and why I've taken it to our senior management to say, this is why supplier quality is important. It's not that we're not doing anything in the past, but we need to step up our game if we truly want to make sure that we're mitigating the risks for the company.
Mm-hmm. And just a little bit more on that, Peter, is there, in terms of staffing for a supplier quality program, is there a right number of employees to have, or things that you need to consider, make sure you're not overlooking?
Yeah, that's another great question. I don't know if there's a magic number. You need to have someone that's responsible for it and accountable for it in your organization. Right. So, you need at least one person who oversees the program. In our organization, we have a couple of people, and we're adding one more for next year. So we're kind of beefing it up because, again, we're managing hundreds of suppliers. And so, I would say a rough rule of thumb. I know that, when you think about if you have to audit suppliers, it's probably, and if you're auditing suppliers every 3 years, probably, one person for every 80 to 100 suppliers. If you think about a rotation, might be about the right number. But again, if you think about all the documentation, et cetera, we're going to have roughly 2.5 people managing, and we have over 800 suppliers that we're managing. So that just gives you a number. But again, a lot of that's documentation, lower risk ones. But then again, you need to think about the audits, et cetera. How robust do you want your program to be?
Okay. And based on that list of suggested documents that you presented earlier, are there any specific documents you find that are often missing or companies, neglect to include as a part of the program?
Yeah, we don't always get the food safety plans. They'll send you their GFSI audit. Yeah, I'm SQF, approved by this certification body, but they may not want to share their food safety plan, which really then takes it a level down, because now you're looking at how are they controlling the micro risk, how are they controlling the allergen risk in their facility. So especially for the ones that we deem high risk, that's an important document to look at. And again, you can PDF it. I mean, as a contract manufacturer, I'm asked for those documents all the time by our customers, many of whom may be on the call. And again, there's ways to share it without, exposing yourself or breaching confidentiality, but it's really providing that confidence that the supplier has the controls that you need in place. Those are just two that come to the top of mind. I mean, obviously also understanding, their specification and their testing regime, like how are they validating their controls and verifying them? I think it's important to understand as well.
Right.
So like I've seen where they won't list their test methods, for example. Like if you're testing for something, well, how are you testing for it?
Okay. Why do you think that is? Like that they won't list the testing methods?
Sometimes they don't realize that you have that as a requirement. Other times they believe it's confidential and don't want to share it.
Right.
But again, I think there's ways to work around that.
No, that's a good point. Another comment that just came in, Peter, is we find suppliers do a good job of complying with providing initial approval documents, but are hesitant or resistant to providing updated documents annually to maintain approval, similar to what you just mentioned. What advice or methods do you have for encouraging compliance for current suppliers?
Get procurement involved. No, I joke a little bit about that, but every supplier wants to maintain and grow their business. Nobody wants to lose business. So you have to make it clear to them that meeting the supplier quality expectations you've set as part of your approval program, your management program, if they don't adhere to that, they eventually could become a disapproved supplier and no longer supplying your business. Obviously I mentioned earlier, there are software tools that help you manage that. Send alerts, automatic alerts to the supplier, reminding them, hey, you're due to provide updated documentation to us. That's also where those couple of people that we have in our organization, that's part of their job. When they see that there's a supplier overdue, they will send them a reminder note. If that gets no response, then we get our procurement team engaged to say, hey, you're at risk of not being able to supply us anymore. So,
Right.
It's a little bit of a carrot and a stick, Paul.
Yeah, understand. I mean, and it's not really a new challenge. I hear that personally myself as well in pretty much a daily setting. But it's important, and we, certainly appreciate your feedback there.
But the more you can automate it, the better. I mean, if you, and again,
Right.
I'm not, vouching for any particular software program, but if you can automate that, it does make it easier for you as well as for the supplier.
Well, I mean, I think moving forward and digitizing your documentation and process and procedures is the way of the future anyway. So, I mean, If you're not doing it, you should start to look at that.
Absolutely.
Okay, Peter, we have time for one final question here before we move into the post-session chat.
Yep.
So with respect to the implications of not having a strong program, I know many companies talk about the cost of implication or cost of implementation. And I know it's important today to discuss and mention the cost of not doing it. So with that, how do you currently balance the pressure on cost from the business when working with suppliers?
Yeah. Well, that's probably the never-ending question. For me, one of the ways that we've done it here, and sort of the justification is, we've kept track of any of the supplier issues that we've had, and so we keep a track of what are the costs that we've imparted, that has been imparted on us, but also the costs on the supplier, and so a lot of the companies, the senior leadership responds to dollars. And so if you can dimensionalize it for them of, here's the real impact of not having a strong supplier approval program. Or remember, we had that issue where we had incoming raw material and we had this type of issue. This was the type of material that had to be destroyed or disposed of. It starts to, really, you get the attention of the finance, the marketing, the other parts of your organization. But I think manage it with your supplier is that, we're all part of a very integrated supply chain now. And I think we're seeing the effects of that with all of the challenges right now with COVID and being able to supply, et cetera. But I always reinforce with the suppliers I talk to, again, there's nothing worth not, skipping a step that causes harm to a consumer or a customer. It's just not worth it, because the impact to you as an organization and the impact to consumers can be, altering, brand altering for you. And, you don't want to be that company that's on the 6 o'clock news. Not that anyone watches that, or at least on the internet. On
7 o'clock.
So yeah, but I think you need, the more you can dimensionalize it, Paul. And I know it's a challenge, but the more you can, you'll get the attention of all the senior leaders in your organization.
Right. Peter, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Peter Begg, ladies and gentlemen, and it's been an amazing session. What a great commentary after. So now I know we're going to move over to the live chat. So at this point, thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you soon, and we'll call it a day. Thanks again, Peter.
Thank you, Paul.
Take care. Okay, guys. Bye-bye.